very warm welcome to the very first session of our brand new course, Czenglish. And before we start discussing the syllabus, the requirements, the tests and the like, which all of you have been waiting for, I guess, there is an unexpected surprise in here waiting for you. And you know, when Chris, Irina and I, my dear colleagues without whom this would never have happened, were discussing all the details of this very first session, we thought that we should mark the occasion, which we felt was rather special, in a special way. And so the most natural choice was to invite the person without whom none of this would be possible, the person who has been an inspiration to generations of students and teachers alike, me too, of course. And
she was one of my best students.
Oh, not true. Now I lost my train of thought. Among his wide variety of activities, Don Sparling had found the time to create an invaluable resource materials for students of English and teachers of English as well, of course, his Czenglish textbook, based on typical errors and mistakes all of us Czech and Slovak speakers of English make repetitively again and again and again. So, over to you.
What more
Nothing
can you say?
What more can I say? Exactly. Welcome, Don. Thank you.
What I would talk a bit about is the genesis of this book, the background to it, some of the problems that I had when writing the book, the reception of the book, and so on. So to begin, I came here, I came to the Czechoslovakia in 1969. I was here in Brno, then I went to Prague for 7 years. And in 1977, I came back here to the English department in Brno. And I was a practical language teacher. My training is literature and so on, but at that point, the only position available was one for practical language teaching. So I began teaching the very small number of students that we had in those communist years. That's another story. But one of the books they were using was a scripta from Olomouc that had been written by Jaroslav Peprník. And I quite liked it. You people will not know the kind of textbooks that were used in communist Czechoslovakia for the teaching of English. They were lousy, or lousier, or very lousy, right? And this was an interesting one. It had mistakes in it and so on, but it was lively and so on. So I heard that Peprník was preparing a set of textbooks for the language schools. And because my wife was teaching in the language school in Brno, I thought, oh, you know, if she's going to have good textbooks in future, maybe I can help Peprník to make them as good as possible. So I wrote to Jaroslav Peprník, who is a very amiable person, and he said, sure, great, join the team, and so on. So I started working on this set of textbooks for the language schools in Czechoslovakia. Many of you perhaps have seen these textbooks. I mean, they basically remain the only Czech set of textbooks for 30 years, even long after the Velvet Revolution. Perhaps many of you have suffered with the Prokop family and so on. It's a kind of a mythical sort of family in Czech English circles. Anyway, I helped him with those books. I helped him with the exercise books that match, the teacher's books that match those books for the language school. And he also wrote 2 textbooks for universities. It was called Angličtina pro filologii. So I was involved with all of these books, and as we were going along, of course, I was also teaching English. So gradually, I was getting totally surrounded by English, teaching of English, and of course, mistakes and correcting mistakes. And at some point I said to myself, this is kind of crazy. I started making a list of the most typical mistakes simply because I thought, I'm tired of correcting the same thing over and over and over again. If I could sort of give students a list of mistakes or whatever, put them together, maybe, at least sometimes, they would stop making these typical mistakes. And so as we were reaching the end of the work on Peppernik's volumes, I spoke to the editor at the Státní pedagogické nakladatelství that was publishing these textbooks, and I said, I've got this kind of idea about blah, blah, blah. She said, oh, that would be interesting. And, one of these wonderful accidents or chances that happens in people's lives, somehow, and I have no memory now how it happened, I found a book called English or Hunglish. And it was written by a native speaker in Hungary who wrote a book about typical mistakes that Hungarian speakers make in English. So I thought, this is it. This is what I want. So it served as a kind of inspiration. I went to Zora Líznerová, the editor in Prague, and I said, look, this is the kind of thing I think I would like to write. And she looked at it and she said, great, this is perfect. And so I began, and I realized when I thought about what I would say to you today, I began 30 years ago, 1985. This is when I finished the books with Peppernik, and immediately I went into these books with this book on English or Czenglish. First of all, I should say that Czenglish is not my invention. It was kind of floating around in some English circles back then in the 1970s. But certainly the fact that it became sort of a common word among English-speaking Czechs is thanks to the book. But I'm going a little bit in advance. I'll go back now to the book. One of the problems that we had, just to explain part of the way why the book looks like it does, is that this was being published by the Státní pedagogické nakladatelství, so it had to be a textbook. I had not originally thought that there was any need for exercises in the book. But my editor in Prague said, if there are no exercises, we can't sell it to the people who have to approve it. We cannot get approval for it as a textbook, and we only publish textbooks in the Státní pedagogické nakladatelství. So I turned to the woman who had done the exercises for Jaroslav Peppernik's books, Stella Nangonova in Ostrava, and so she agreed to do the exercise part of it. But that wasn't originally conceived as part of the book. So I worked away on it. I got a good chunk of the book done in the summer of 1986. We have a cottage in the Vysočina, a beautiful cottage in the Vysočina, and I would spend my mornings writing up from all of my files that I had collected over the previous 20 years, 3 or 4 or 5 Hesla items, entries, whatever, right? Then I wrote them in English. Then in the afternoon, my wife, who's a teacher of English, as I said, she would go through them and translate them into Czech and comment on them and say, well, this doesn't really work when you translate it into Czech, or what about this? And then we would discuss it, and then she would prepare the final version taking into account. So it was very much a cooperative job between the two of us. So that was in the summer of 86. Then in 87, I continued slowly during the school year, the academic year, because, as you all know, teachers are overburdened. And so if they're doing research or other work, they kind of fit it into 10 minutes here and an evening there, and so on. And by about February or March, I thought I couldn't complete. I had said I would complete it by the summer of 1987. I think I said to myself, I can't do this. I just can't get it done by then. So I wrote to my editor, to Mrs. Líznerová in Prague, and said, I'm sorry, I don't think I can get it done. And she wrote back and she said, you'll have to get it done. She said, the problem is that we have to then get it approved by somebody, and the man who is most likely to approve it is retiring in the summer. If it's not done by the summer, we can more or less forget about this book, because a lot of people don't think this book is needed. So I was going to Canada in the summer, and I remember very well, I finished the last entry, I typed it up, and this is an age before computers, don't forget, I typed it up on my little portable typewriter, with copies on onion skin paper through carbon paper. I mean, very primitive. I bundled the thing, and as we got on the train to go to Budapest to get the plane to Canada, I handed in the manuscript at the Hlavní Pošta down there. So I just made it. That was 1987. The book appeared in 1989, 2 years later. Gives you some idea of how things functioned in communist Czechoslovakia. It took 2 years to go through all the different areas of approval, blah, 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 blah. So finally, in September of 1989, the book came out. You people are too young to remember. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that. I fall into this kind of trope of, I remember the old days, right? But they had a very odd custom in this country in the communist years, was that all new books were put on sale on Thursdays. So on Thursdays, you usually saw queues in front of bookshops because some particularly interesting book was coming out, let's say a translation of something by Joseph Heller or Roth or something like that, and people would queue up because the bookstore might get 10 copies, right, and so on. Very bizarre cultural custom. Anyway, the contract I had signed with the Státní pedagogické nakladatelství was for 10,000 copies. And I said to them, 10,000 copies isn't very much. I think this could be a bestseller. And they said, well, this is something new, we don't know, it's a kind of a risk, blah, blah, blah. So they would only give me a contract for 10,000 copies. The 10,000 copies, of course, sold out in one day. They were spread out over the country. Each bookshop in remote Slovakia, in Prague, Brno, got whatever, 10 copies. It was sold out in one day. So immediately, they asked me to sign a contract for a second edition. And I got the contract, and I looked at it, and I said, this is weird. It was for 100,000 copies, and the amount I was getting was half the amount of money that I got for 10,000 copies. So I wrote to them, I said, what is this? They said, oh, well, that's our practice. Each succeeding edition of a successful book, the honorage for the author is 50% of the previous one. So I said, the more successful it is, the less money you get? And they said, oh, yes, yes. And I said, this doesn't make sense. They said, well, the risk was ours. We took the risk of publishing this book, right? So unfortunately, this was September 1989. The book had also got very good reviews. I was very flattered, I would say. There was a very, very good review from Antonín Přidal here in Brno, in which he pointed out that it was not only a book about English, but it was also a book about Czech culture and so on, because of the way that many of the entries have to do with what works in English but doesn't work in Czech, because the Czech customs are different and you can't just translate things into English. So it was a highly successful book, but I had no choice. There was one publishing house in the country that would publish it. They gave me a contract for this ridiculous amount of money. So I signed it, and that was like in October of 1989. A month later, the Velvet Revolution. Suddenly, everybody wants to speak English. And of course, when the book then appeared, maybe in January or February of 1990, it wasn't sold out immediately. 100,000 copies is a lot. But it sold very, very well. Then the Státní pedagogické nakladatelství went bankrupt. And books ended up in some sort of storeroom somewhere. And about 1993 or something, they started to appear in these Levné knihy. But eventually, apparently, all 100,000 copies got sold and are spread out somewhere in the country and have become kind of collector's items. And you sometimes see it on the internet. Somebody, is sending, Hledam, English or Czenglish. Anyway, maybe it's even on eBay. I don't know. But it's also been pirated. I came across a grammar school up in Boskovice, I think, that's got it on their website for their English students and so on. So it's available in many places. Back a little bit, what were the kind of problems that I was faced with? Well, there were two main problems. One is that, of course, this was communist Czechoslovakia, and so the kind of links to the West were minimal. the availability of material was minimal. You couldn't just sort of order 10 or 20 or 30 books to work from. The second problem, of course, was that this was the era before internet and so on, so I had nothing I could electronic resource of that kind to work with. And the third thing, I suppose there were three problems, was there were so few native speakers I could sort of consult with. It's hard for people to imagine, but in Brno in the 1980s, in Brno, in the whole of Brno, there were 5 native speakers of English. 5. 2 were old ladies who had married Czech airmen in the Second World War and had come here in 1945. One was an American woman of Czech origin who had been here in the 60s and fell in love. Me and a British guy similar to me. So there wasn't a great number of people I could turn to ask for advice and so on. So basically I was dependent on my few books that I had and myself. I was just thinking of one. Sorry, I tend to do this when I start talking. I go out on little asides, and then I will get back to the main line. But in the late 19th century, there was a famous trial in London. John Ruskin, the writer and art critic, had criticized paintings by Whistler, the painter Whistler, saying it was like throwing a pot of paint in the public's face. And Whistler took him to court for defamation. And in the course of the proceedings, the defense lawyer for Ruskin asked Whistler, "How long did it take you to paint this painting?" Because the point was he was asking a lot of money for it. He said, "How long did it take?" And he said, "Oh, it took me a couple of hours." He said, "You're charging like £10,000 for a couple of hours' work?" And Whistler said, "I'm charging it for the experience of a lifetime." And basically that was what English or Czenglish is. It was my experience of a lifetime using English, right? I had studied English language and literature at the university in Toronto. I'd studied in Oxford, and I have a kind of obsession with English since the age of 10 or 11 or 12, when I asked my parents for Christmas gifts to give me dictionaries and books on English usage and so on. So I've always been slightly obsessed with English as such. And the problem is that there is no standard for English. You can look at 2 dictionaries and find, one says it's colloquial, the other says it's fine, and so on. So basically I had to depend on my instinct as to what to put in and what not to put in. And I chose what I call neutral English. That is to say, I thought students in this country, particularly then in the communist years when they had so little chance to actually come into contact with colloquial English or anything, real speakers of English, the best thing for them was if they could learn to use an English which was what I call neutral, not too high style, not colloquial. So this was the way I worked. I would think, does it work, does it not work? And it was, as I said, very difficult because many of the problems I was faced with had no solution that I could turn to. There was no book, there was no grammar book, there was no dictionary which would give me an answer as to whether this book was widespread, whether this word was in use, in widespread use, whether it was a fairly narrow definition, and so on and so on. So I did this, the book came out, and it became very, very successful. I've been approached many times in the succeeding, whatever it is now, 25 years, asking whether there'll be another edition of it. There have been 2 or 3 attempts at updating it, and so on. But the only really serious attempt started here in the English department a couple of years ago, and we worked a little bit on it. And it's still a kind of aim that we have is to produce a new version of it, one that is, as Czechs say, actualized. And this new updated version, hopefully, perhaps in the next year or 2 will appear. We've even talked about having a version of it in English, because one of the graduate students here at the department actually translated the whole thing into English, and it was very interesting. And in the process of this, we were already starting to make changes and saying this really isn't relevant anymore, and so on. So the idea was then that perhaps the English version could be electronic, and the print version then would be the Czech version, and so on. But in some ways, or in many ways, I would say, and in an important way, this course that you people are involved in is certainly a very, very major step forward in the renewal and revival of English or Czenglish. So I'd like to thank the teachers very much for all the work they've put into this. And I hope you have a great semester. Okay, that's it.